Want to thank Ed. Ed, great to have you with us, man.
My pleasure, John. No apologies necessary.
Ed, let's get right to Ukraine. Let's get right to Syria. Let's get right to Syria and the Kurds and the fallout with the president trying to get her troops out of harm's way. And one of the Kurdish leaders coming to Washington today, engaging the press immediately, blasting Trump for abandoning. She called it encouraging genocide. What's the Middle East media saying, and what's your overall take on what is happening there?
Much of the media is supportive of the president in the Arab world because the argument is this is Syrian government territory, and it's time to start letting Syria put itself back together again. So you might be surprised that much of the Arab media, other than Qatar's media, has been supportive of the president. And my personal take is that most of the commentators that I've seen, and I just read something on CNN, I don't usually check their website, but it was, I just couldn't avoid it. It just blasted Trump on Syria for just about everything he did. And the irony of it is, if you watch that Project Veritas expose of Jeff Zucker and how he was doing some ugly things behind the scenes to manipulate the news, it's surprising that they have the gall to call the president a liar. So anyway, I'm surprised Jeff Zucker still has a job today. Clearly, the rest of the media doesn't have the gumption to tell him to quit. And personally, as I said before, the last time we spoke, I've always sympathized with the Kurds. I don't feel good about leaving them there, but they've been fighting their own battles for 35 years, and they've cut a deal with the Syrian government. The Syrian government has moved into the border in a number of places, and I think ultimately that's what's going to happen because President Putin is not going to let the situation stay this way and have Turkish troops on Syrian government soil. So I think in terms of international law, that's the right way to go. And the president was taking guff from a well-known NBC correspondent, whom I won't name, for moving troops into Iraq, saying that it's more dangerous in Iraq than in Kurdistan, which is not true because the base they were moved to Ain al-Assad, which used to be the Qadisiyah air base under Saddam Hussein, is pretty well defended. I really can't imagine military people going for a stroll around the Qadisiyah air base. So I think they're just fine there, and ultimately they'll probably be withdrawn or their numbers will be lessened whenever the need arises.
Eddie, what is the ultimate goal of Erdogan? How does he want to see this end? Erdogan, the president of Turkey. What would make this successful for Erdogan?
I'm just extrapolating from what many people say in the Arab media, and many of them are his detractors, but trying to put that aside, and I'm Armenian, so I don't have a lot of sympathy for him, but putting all that aside, I think ultimately he's trying to resurrect, in part, the Ottoman Empire and have zones of influence, Turkish influence, in various parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, used to control Egypt. They used to control Tunisia, Libya, Algeria. Of course, some of this is going way, way back because the French controlled Algeria and Tunisia. More recently, the Italians controlled Libya. But there are Turkish minorities in many of these places, and I guess in a way you could argue, if you wanted to argue, that he has a legitimate reason to have troops in some parts of northern Iraq and northern Syria because they're Turkic peoples, Turkmen, who are still there, who have been there since the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, he could have a point there, although if you follow international law, which is based on post-World War II, borders, that basically he should not have his troops in either of these places.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that what his objectives are. Look, there's a minor defense for what he's trying to do. A lot of Turks have been killed on the border. They do see some of the Kurdish fighters as terrorists. I can sympathize with that. When you're getting your civilians killed, it's tough to sit there and not act. Now, the way they're doing it can be criticized. What is Assad's objective in this?
He's trying to recover the border areas, and that's the Syrian government army has moved troops to along the border north of Aleppo in a town that the Kurds controlled up until very recently called Manbij, which is really a satellite town of Aleppo. So they've regained control of parts of their border. Ultimately, I think that's the goal of the Syrian government, and the Syrian government clearly doesn't have a lot of sympathy for Turkey. Turkey actually occupies the historic capital of Syria, which is Antioch, now called Antakya, a little strip along the border that the Turks call Hatay. I know that because my father was from that area. It was occupied by the French. It's called Iskenderun also, which is after Alexander the Great, whose generals divided up his empire in three. And Antioch is the historic capital of Syria, Byzantine Syria, I guess. So Turkey does control this territory, other territory than its own, and many of those people are Arabic-speaking people, even though they're now in Turkey. Right. So Turkey has territory that's questionable whether they should have either.
Eddie Yeranian with us, the veteran correspondent at CBS Radio News in Cairo, live Egypt. He's also senior correspondent with The Voice of America. Ed, let me ask you this. Is there a vision here for Assad to reunify his country?
I think that this is the goal that some leaders are pushing for, not saying it very loudly. I think President Trump is ultimately working in this direction. Clearly, he doesn't want Iran to take advantage of the situation. If Bashar al-Assad said tomorrow we're going to limit Iran's movements in Syria, I'm sure he'd get a lot of support from European governments and from the U.S. and even from Arab governments. He can't do that really because the Iranians have supported him, and he wouldn't be in power today if it weren't for both Iran and Russia. So ultimately, I think the goal is to give him pieces of his country back so he can put it together again, and hopefully he will start distancing himself from Iran. And I think the last piece is the U.S. controls the main border crossing with Iraq, the Tenef border crossing, and I think President Trump would like to get out of there and give that back too, and pull those troops out and send them to Al-Qadisiyah Air Base in Anbar province as well. But I think we're a ways off for that.
So I'm going to go through everybody's objective. Here's the final one. What is Russia's end game here in Syria?
Russia's end game, they say, is to keep the borders of sovereign states under the control of those sovereign states. Russia controls an air base, Hamas air base, and the port of Tartus, and they've gotten a number of concessions, I believe, from the government for a number of years, not just military, economic concessions. So they would like to see Syria become the client state it used to be in the 70s and 80s, client of the former Soviet Union. They're also looking at Libya, which used to be something of a Russian-Soviet client state. I don't think they're very close to doing that. So they're trying to spread their influence across the Mediterranean. Many people look at this in a bad way, but Syria is really nothing compared to all the client states they used to have. They used to have Yemen. They used to have Algeria. They used to have, as I said, Libya. They used to have, I'm trying to think where else, but they have a lot of territories they no longer control. So Syria is Iraq. It used to be a Russian client, a Soviet client state. So Syria is just a tiny fraction of the former Soviet empire of client states in the Middle East.
Eddie Yeranian, we're out of time. I want to thank you for your patience today. Great insight. Ed Yeranian, senior correspondent, CBS Radio News and Voice of America, and our man in the Middle East on the John Fredericks Radio Network. Eddie, thank you. Really appreciate it.